Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We had a really huge registration for this event, probably because it involves politics and the election, and that's a really big topic right now. I know many of you can't be here live at the time, so do know that I have all of your questions and I will be sure that they get answered during this event today. So for all of you who are not live, but send your questions in advance for the recording, I will get them. And questions will be at the end of the presentation today. So for any of you who are live, you do have questions. My suggestion is send them in right away. So I'd be sure to kind of aggregate and pull them all together. So that being said, housekeeping is over. For any of you that are watching this for the very first time, my name is Christina Caprina, and I'm the Chief Economist and Portfolio Manager at Sequoia Wealth Advisors. And about once a month, we do an outlook on the economy, talk a little bit about some of the most important topics in the economy, what's going on. The intention behind this is sometimes the news can be really noisy and not necessarily the most accurate way to get information. And also to make a lot of economic topics presentable and clear to the average person, as well as have your questions answered directly. So any of you who have been watching this over time may have recall Bob Stein. He comes, fortunately, he comes to us every election year. We're very blessed to have his presence, as he is a very busy person. And he's out in Washington, actually Virginia, in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to read his bio here, a part of his bio here in just a moment, but he's very dialed into what's happening in Washington. So for the purpose of today, we're going to call him the news slayer, because he's going to bring us to the facts on the ground. And I really want to say one thing about it. It's got to be a really challenging thing with all the changes that have been happening in this election cycle, especially over the last month or so, just keeping up with all of that and keeping your information clear. So we're really grateful again to have this presentation today. For those of you who are less familiar with Bob Stein, have not seen him on financial news, or have not heard this presentation before, he has an extensive experience both as an economist at First Trust and also within Washington, D.C. So I'll just read a portion of his bio here very quickly to give you a little bit of his background. Prior to joining First Trust, Bob was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department. While there, Bob was responsible for briefing the Secretary of the Treasury on U.S. macroeconomic developments, formulating policy proposals, and help generating the official economic forecast used by the president for budget proposals. Day to day, he led a team of 20 economists conducting in-depth economic analysis and research. Between 1996 and 2002, Bob was an economist on Capitol Hill, including the last 2 years as chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee. While on Capitol Hill, Bob also worked for the Senate Banking Committee and Joint Economic Committee. Prior to his tenure on Capitol Hill, he was an economic journalist for Investors Business Daily. So I hope that gives you a kind of idea of his experience, his background, and his deep connection to Washington, D.C. And so what Bob is going to do today is he's going to do his presentation. I'm going to put a caveat out here. I apologize, Bob, if you're going to do this yourself, which is, this is a point in time, August 20th, 2024. This is subject to change multiple times between now and the election. So do take this with that giant grain of salt. I will be presenting updates and have updated information from Bob and his team. So anyone who wants an update as we progress towards the election, please let me know. I'll be happy to get that to you. But remember, point in time, as we all know, things have been changing quite a bit here with this election. So Bob will do his presentation. Any questions you have, again, have questions I've already sent in advance. Also, questions you want to send in now, send them in, and we'll get them all answered. And if time permits, I'll answer the remaining economic questions that came across that are not specific to this subject. So that being said, I'm going to be sitting here quietly off camera. And without further ado, Bob Stein.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. So I'm very happy to be here today. I wish I could come into this web seminar and be the bearer of good news. Unfortunately, if I were, I'd be lying to you. You know, when I look at that deep inversion of the yield curve, where short-term interest rates are consistently above long-term interest rates over the past year or so, a yield curve that is likely to remain inverted at least until early next year, I see some economic trouble ahead. Now, when I say economic trouble, it doesn't necessarily have to mean a recession, but I do think we're going to have at least a prolonged period a very slow plodding economic growth over the next year and a year and a half ahead of us. In terms of the equity markets, I think stocks are roughly 10% or so overvalued. That does not mean, it does not mean you should run for the hills by any stretch of the imagination. We're not in an overvaluation situation like we were 24 years ago at the peak of the internet boom in the year 2000. We're not as overvalued as we were going into the Great Recession and financial panic of 2008 and 2009. But I do think we're modestly overvalued. And what that means is that after talking to your financial advisor, maybe you should be a little less invested in equities than you normally would be at this point in time, given your age, your risk profile, your financial goals. But if the yield curve has been inverted so long, it also begs the question, why haven't we hit this economic problem yet? And in my opinion, it's because last year's federal budget was probably the most reckless budget of my lifetime. Now, I know this is 2024. It's obviously an election year. So when people see you talking about federal government policy, they assume you have a political angle, okay? With me, that's not the case. I spent 8 years defending the budgets under President Obama. I then spent 4 years defending the budgets under President Trump. None of those 12 budgets were the kind of budget that I personally would have written had I been king of the world, but they weren't going to lead the country to wreck and ruin. Last year's budget deficit was a little bit different. Allow me to explain. First, some context. Back in the 1980s, we had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was consistently criticized by the opposition party, then the Democrats, by the media, even by many of his fellow Republicans, for running overly large budget deficits. And yet the budget deficit, the largest Reagan ever ran, was in 1982, when it was 5.9% of GDP. Last year's budget deficit was 6.3% of GDP, even largest than the largest we ever ran under Reagan in the 1980s. But Reagan actually had an excuse in 1982. In fact, he had two excuses. One, he was fully funding the Pentagon at the height of the Cold War. But number two, to me, is more important as a macroeconomist, which is that we had an unemployment rate in 1982 that averaged 10%. Last year's unemployment rate averaged 3.6%, almost as low as 1/3 of where it was 40 years before. And yet the budget deficit was actually bigger than it was 40 years before. But it's even worse than what I just told you, because this deficit calculation for last year includes the effect of the Supreme Court striking down a large part of President Biden's plan to forgive student loans. Now, that legal decision did not change the government's cash flow at all last year, but it did allow the Department of Education to write up the value of its loan portfolio. The Education Department could reasonably assume, because of that ruling, that more people would have to pay on their student loans in the future. So they got to write up the value of their portfolio. They did so to the tune of 1.2 percentage points of GDP. And even though it didn't change the government's cash flow, that was included into the calculation of the deficit. So were it not for that decision, the official deficit last year would have been 7.5% of GDP, not 6.3, dwarfing the largest deficit we ever had under Reagan. And here we were last year with an unemployment rate of below 4%. To me, that's overly reckless when it comes to budget policy. But I also think that expansion in the underlying deficit has masked or hidden some of the economic pain we will eventually feel from that tightening of monetary policy over the last couple of years. The budget deficit this year is also going to be enormous, but it's not going to grow like it did the previous year. And because it won't grow as much, I think the chickens are eventually coming home to roost late this year, early next year. Doesn't matter who we elect this November, on that tightening of monetary policy that I previously discussed. It won't be the end of the world, but I think we're in for some rougher economic waters in the year ahead than in the past couple of years. In terms of politics, I am about to run through my odds on certain election outcomes. The only thing I can tell you for sure, here we are, 11 weeks, 77 days from election day, is that these odds are going to change between now and November. They may change dramatically. That's the one thing I can tell you, is that they are going to change. But all I can do is give you the odds the way I see them today. Now, I have to also tell you that I'm not here to regurgitate what the odds makers say. I'm here to regurgitate what the prediction markets say. Sometimes I agree, and sometimes I do not. So let me go and tell you what I think is going on. As of today, again, about 77 days, or exactly 77 days from Election Day, Kamala Harris is ahead in the polls by roughly 2 percentage points against Donald Trump. But here's where Donald Trump was in 2020 and 2016 relative to Hillary Clinton and relative to Joe Biden. In those respective election battles, he was behind by roughly 7 percentage points on average in those two cycles. At the same exact point, 77 days away from the election. Right now, he's behind by 2 points. What that tells me is that Donald Trump should not panic and that he still has a decent chance of winning. It's not going to be a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination, but here's the way I think about it and frame the election. In the last two election cycles, Donald Trump has done better on election day in the actual vote than he did earlier in the year in the polls. In addition, I estimate him to have roughly a 1.5 percentage point edge in the Electoral College relative to the popular vote. Putting those together, if we wake up on the eve of the election or the morning of the election, no votes have been counted yet, and Vice President Harris is ahead of the polls by around 2.5 percentage points, I'd say it's a toss-up, 50-50, and we really don't know who's going to win. But here Harris is in what I believe is a honeymoon period, given the nature of how she became the nominee, with Joe Biden withdrawing so late in the process, and she's ahead by about 2 percentage points, not 2.5. So as of today, I give Donald Trump about a 60% chance of winning. Now, can you take this to the bank? Absolutely not. If any of you play cards, if any of you sometimes wager on sporting events, the underdog wins. If they have a 40% chance of winning, they're going to win 40% of the time. So I would not be shocked at all from this point forward if Vice President Harris were to win. But at this point, I do give Donald Trump a slight edge. In terms of the U.S. Senate, I've coded each and every state with a Senate race this year, according to whether the incumbent is a Democrat, in which case it's blue, or a Republican, in which case it's red. And then I divided them up according to whether those races are happening in Democratic states, Republican states, or states in the middle of the political spectrum. And yes, we could quibble. Maybe Florida belongs here, maybe Minnesota here, but these are basically the 10 states in the middle of the political spectrum for this particular election cycle. And a few things should jump out at you when you look at these columns. Number one, there is not one Republican Senate seat, not one in this cycle that has to be defended in a Democratic state. And yet there are 3 Democratic seats that have to be defended in Republican states. In the state of West Virginia, the Republicans are almost certainly going to win because Joe Manchin, the only person in the state of West Virginia who could have kept that state, plausibly kept that state on the Democratic side, decided not to run. In addition, the Republican is ahead in the state of Montana right now. And even though Bernie Moreno is not a very strong candidate for the Republicans in the state of Ohio, given that Donald Trump chose J.D. Vance as his running mate, I think in the end, the Republicans probably win Ohio as well. In addition, they have some opportunities for pickups in other states like Nevada, like Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Maryland, and maybe even Arizona. They're underdogs in each of those, but they have a possible fighting chance in each of them as well. Right now, the Republicans have 49 Senate seats. Democrats have 51. With West Virginia, it goes 50-50. And I think the Republicans probably end up with 52 or 53 seats in the U.S. Senate. Look at it from the Democratic side, though. What do the Democrats have to do to keep control of the U.S. Senate? Well, number one, Harris has to win. I already told you that's only about a 40% chance. On top of that, after losing West Virginia, they would have to run the table on every other competitive race in this cycle. I think the odds of that are at most 10%. Because of that, correspondingly so, I think the Democrats only have about a 10% shot of sweeping this election, controlling the House, the Senate, and the presidency as well. On the other hand, I think the Republicans have about a 45% chance of a sweep, and that leaves 2 possibilities for mixed government over at least the next 2 years. Each of these different four scenarios has very different implications for the course of public policy over the next several years. If there's a Republican sweep, they will extend and possibly deepen the tax cuts originally enacted 7 years ago under President Trump. But there will be a scramble for deficit reduction that sets in sometime over the next few years. I think Donald Trump will respond to that scramble by raising tariffs, curtailing, not ending, not eliminating, but reducing green energy subsidies and reforming Medicaid for low-income folks as well. The Republicans will not have the votes to do any reforms on Social Security. I don't think they'll have the vote. They won't have the inclination to do anything significant on Medicare, but I think they'll have both the votes and the inclination to go after Medicaid, including parts of Obamacare, block granting it to the states and letting the states squeeze those programs for budget savings over time. It is also possible, unlikely, but possible, that if Donald Trump wins, he would have to face off against a narrow Democratic majority in the US House. And if that happens, I'm only giving it a 15% chance, but if it happens, you have to be ready. I think the tax cuts will be extended, but it is going to cost the Republicans and Donald Trump politically. I think the top rate on regular income would have to go back to 39.6%, like it was for 8 years under Clinton and the last 4 under President Obama. And in addition, the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction, would go from 20 to 25,000 instead. In addition, in this scenario, Donald Trump would raise tariffs, and there would be an arcane but important constitutional battle about something called impoundment, whether or not the president has the power on his own to rescind spending and save money for the taxpayer. It would end up going to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure which way this issue would go with the court, but it's possible that the president would be found to have certain powers to save money that in the past 50 years, presidents have not been able to exercise. If Vice President Harris rises to the Oval Office, I think in that scenario, about a 30% scenario, she would have to face off against a Republican Senate. In the end, I think she ends up extending the tax cuts on the individual side, and here's why. Because the Republicans will jam her. They will tell her, if you want to extend the tax cuts for anyone, you're going to have to extend the tax cuts for almost everyone. So I think the top rate would go back to 39.6%. However, the rest of the tax cuts would be extended. But this is also a scenario with little to no deficit reduction in the years ahead. Because if the tax cuts extended, that's going to cost the government a little bit of revenue. Meanwhile, I don't think the Harris administration would cut Medicare or Social Security or Medicaid or Obamacare or green energy subsidies. So we'd have big spending with the extension of the tax cuts. That's a recipe for $2.5 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see, or at least for the next 4 years. If we end up with a Democratic sweep, very unlikely, my least likely scenario, if you look at the prediction markets, they've recently said about 25% or so. I don't think they're right. I think it's much lower than that. But if this happens, regardless of what the odds of it happening are, if it happens, I think the top rate goes back to 39.6% on regular income. The long-term capital gains and dividend rate, now 20%, goes to 24%. The estate tax exemptions go halfway back down to where they were in 2017 and before. The corporate rate, which used to be 35 pre-Trump, now 21, would go halfway back to 28%. And in addition, I think the Democratic Party in this scenario, 10% only, in this scenario would toy with the idea of introducing a carbon tax into the USA. In previous cycles, many years ago, Democrats would often represent in the US Senate carbon-intensive states, carbon-intensive congressional districts. But that era has passed, and so I think it's much easier today than it used to be for a narrow Democratic Senate to introduce a carbon tax into the USA. One more thing I'd like to talk about, and that's the long-term budget outlook in the USA. A lot of people are worried about the national debt or the deficit. I think the best way, however, to measure the manageability of the debt is to look at the interest cost generated by that debt relative to GDP. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was regularly 3% of GDP, then a bunch of good stuff happened. and we spend 20 years or so at 1.5% of GDP instead. I call this era the age of candy. What happened politically in this era? We cut taxes in 2001, 2003, and 2017. In 2003, we embarked on a very expensive discretionary war in the Middle East. I'm not saying the war was wrong. I'm not saying the war was right. I'm saying it was discretionary and expensive. And in 2004, we added a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. And in 2010, we had the first major expansion of entitlements since the 1960s. And ever since, there have been a contingent of Democrats calling for Medicare for all. Why did all this happen? Because when the interest burden on the debt is low, politicians eventually realize they have a lot of money lying around to buy our votes. And that's exactly what they did. But the age of candy, my friends, is coming to an end. Last year, the interest burden was 2.4% of GDP. And this year, it's going to be around 3%. When all is said and done, we'll get that official number. The fiscal year ends at the end of September. We'll get the official number in mid-October. I suspect it'll be right around where it was in the 80s and 90s, 3% of GDP. The good news is I don't think we go to 4% or above, because I think sometime over the next few years, the politics of limits are going to kick back in. What are the politics of limits? Politics of limits being bipartisan sometimes and partisan sometimes measures both tax increases and spending limits to bring the deficit back down. It's what we had from 1982 to 1998. And I think that will revive itself as that interest burden goes up. The bad news, folks, is that I don't think there's happy time back here when the interest burden fell in the latter 1990s and in the early part of the decade that followed. I don't think this happens again for the remainder of any of our times. Okay, here's why. What happened during this time frame? We had the baby boom generation hitting their peak earning years. We had Social Security and Medicare, a lower part of the federal budget, and we had a peace dividend left over from winning the Cold War. What do we got now? We got the baby boom generation hitting the beach and the golf course, not their peak earning years. We have Social Security and Medicare, a larger and growing share of the federal budget. We have China and North Korea and Iran preparing for war. Now, knock wood, there are no wars, especially not involving the USA. But if we want to prevent the wars of the future, we darn well better be prepared for the wars of the future. And that means a whole heck of a lot more military and national defense spending over the next couple of decades compared to this era of candy. The age of candy is over. It is going to be the politics of limits as far as the eye can see. Thank you very much for your time, and I would be delighted to answer any questions you have.
Oh, that was fun. That's my new word, impoundment. I actually didn't know anything about that. That's going to be a very interesting era to see. We do have some questions, and I'm going to do them in not any particular order. I said, can you expand on how the Republicans may make cuts to Medicaid? I don't know if you have an answer for that, but that was a question.
I do. Now, first of all, let's be specific. Not to Medicare, but to Medicaid. They will make cuts to Medicaid. They will essentially do for Medicaid and parts of Obamacare what they did, including with the Clinton administration on board, to welfare reform and the old AFDC program for poor parents back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, so what they did was they took the money that they anticipated spending on that program, and they block granted to the states, and then set a formula where that money would grow in the future, but not quite as fast as it had previously grown. And they would let states set largely their own rules on these issues. So that's what I think is going to happen to Medicaid right now. Right now, the system is states get to decide what they cover, and then the federal government covers almost all the cost with very little skin in the game, just a little teeny bit from the states themselves fiscally. Okay, so a state decides, well, we're going to provide certain kinds of health care to low-income folks, and the federal government, and thereby the federal taxpayer will pay for it. But if the money is block granted to the states, well, now the states have an incentive to say, well, certain things we're going to cover and certain things we're not going to cover, because that bucket of money for things a bucket of money we're getting from the federal government will stay with us whether we cover it or not. And we might want to use that money for other projects and other things going on in our state. So it's basically a block granting similar to the welfare reform that happened in the 1990s.
Okay. You're gonna have thank you. You're gonna have some fun ones here too. Some more political. I'll just throw this one out. It says, which candidate is better for the economy?
Wow.
I'm assuming this means presidential. So go for it.
Yeah. So
Take that bull by the horns.
Okay. Yeah. When I do my presentations, I really like to steer clear of my own personal preferences. If you notice, when I talk about politics, I talk about what I think will happen, not what I want to happen. To me, that's secondary. So I'd rather not answer this, but okay. In my personal view, the economy is going to do what it does next year and maybe even early 2026. It will have nothing to do with the election outcome. And I try to focus as a macroeconomist on what's going to happen over the next couple of years. Now, that said, very long term, I have to say that I think a Trump administration will be a little bit better for the economy, very long term, because he would more seriously take on the Medicaid entitlement. And we have long-term fiscal issues between Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security that have to be tackled. He is not willing to take on Social Security. He is not willing to take on Medicare, but I don't think the Harris administration would be either. So at least he would be willing to take on Medicaid, and I think that would be a long-term benefit. Things like tax policy, taxes fluctuate up and down, tariffs might fluctuate up and down, easy to change. Changing entitlements is a big job. And so if our long-term fiscal survival requires some addressing of our long-term entitlement situation, I think Donald Trump is a little more likely to do that than Vice President Harris.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're speaking as an economist, and of course, not telling anyone what their decision making. As I've said in the past, people vote for more than just the economics of their decision. There are other issues that can cause people to vote one way or the other.
Certainly.
I just see it as our responsibility to bring up the economic fiscal components to it, because that's why people are here.
And notice I didn't even say it was really important to vote on the basis of economics.
Yeah.
Because it's up to each person to decide what issue is important to them and what issue is not. And it's not for one person to tell the other person foreign policy is or isn't important, or social or cultural issues aren't important. Now, it's up for each voter to decide what the cluster of issues that they want to vote on really is.
Wow, that's going to tie in very well to what I was going to say later. What will happen to the markets if the election is contested?
Wow. I don't think a contested election would be very healthy for the financial markets. In particular, not just because of what it says about who will become president this cycle, but the prospect for more contested elections in the future. I think America is not necessarily in a good place when it comes to these contested elections and the prospects for fraud or the fear of fraud, legitimate or otherwise, going forward. So this is just something we're going to have to grapple with going forward, and it's not good. But I don't think whether or not this election is contested is likely to be a major issue at the time that your clients or investors are pulling their money out of, and spending their money out of their retirement accounts in the future. So you have to remember, what ultimately matters to you as an investor are only things that will influence the valuation of the markets, whether fixed income or equities, at the time you're withdrawing your money. If you're not withdrawing it spend over the next few years in any substantial amount, well, then it's really not that important of an issue.
And that ties very much into the importance of communication for all of you who are clients of mine or Sequoia's, to us. For any of you who have your other advisors outside, this communication about your needs, your expectations, and your plan is so critically important, because there will be multiple elections in your lifetime. There will always be something happening with fiscal policy. There will always be shocks and surprises. How you navigate that is having a very good advisor and clear communication on both strategy and your needs. So I want to put that out there to kind of goes ahead of a lot of these things. Let's see here. Okay, so I think there was a couple questions about the Medicaid, and if I just reiterate what you said to make sure it's clear, because there's more came in. Essentially, the potential for Trump's reform in this place, if he's to do so, if he's to win and do so, is more about giving block grants to the states and letting them decide how to spend the money than a wholesale cut of the system. That's how I
Correct. It would be a very gradual. It'd be a very gradual. There wouldn't be any outright cuts. Like Medicaid spending will not go down, but it would grow more slowly under the block grant system into the future than it otherwise would. So over the course of a full generation, discounted to present value, that could be quite a bit of savings.
Okay, all right, that because there was a lot of question around that. I think you explained it clearly. It goes to the states. And
remember, this is Medicaid for low-income folks. It is not Medicare for senior citizens.
Yeah. Oh, that's going to be a fun nut to untangle in the future. That's for sure. Okay, let's go over here. Some of these I haven't read yet, so I'm just going to read them live. So I haven't seen what it says yet. What is your assessment for the economic situation if Trump wins with Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, in the cabinet, continuing to support him at $48 million a month?
Okay. Elon Musk is not going to serve in the cabinet, period. He's got too much on his plate. It's just not going to happen. It's all chatter, talk, online BS. It's not going to happen. Informal advisor at most, part-time.
Yeah. He doesn't strike me as a person that would enjoy politics.
Yeah, he's not going to serve in the cabinet. That's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you. And again, I'm reading these live, so nobody throw tomatoes at me. How will the recent influx of illegal aliens affect your numbers?
Not at all, because I assume it will continue at least through early next year. And then you know, moving forward, it'll depend on who we elect. If we elect Harris, then it will largely continue, maybe slow a little bit. And if we elect Trump, it will eventually slow a lot. But I don't know which path we're going to go on. And it's not going to be an earth-shattering difference for the pace of economic growth over the next 1.5 to 2 years, what I'm trying to forecast, either way. Which is not to say it's not an important issue, but it's not, you know, based on what I just looked at, you know, the issues I just looked at, it isn't an issue for that purpose.
Okay. And that's an interesting thing, because tying into that is what is the economic, and I wanted to separate out, I know there's a lot of sensitivity to various terms, and I'm not always good at the political correct stuff because I don't know all the terms, but using immigration and using, you know, documented, undocumented, legal, illegal, we need immigration. We need a lot of it to run our country. We just got the CDC just released today that the birth rates are dropping in the United States. So to run our economy, immigration is critical. So there's a difference between immigrants good, immigrants bad, and just vetting everybody that crosses the border, so that we just know who's coming in. And again, we need this from an economic perspective, but how do we manage that is the big political topic. I just want to kind of throw out the economic view on that. I know that, again, there's a lot that goes to the subject. It's a very heated political topic. From a pure economics, though, the country is what it is because we have immigration, but how we manage that is the topic for debate. Let's see, what is the effects of climate change factored in? Oh, sorry, where are the effects of climate change factored in? Insurers are feeling the pinch, and it's only going to accelerate with the unknown price tag and human toll.
Okay, so I got to go after these assumptions here. So, I mean, I think climate change is real. and mankind does contribute to it. I don't think we can know with any great degree of specificity how much we're contributing. And I think the range of plausible outcomes with the climate over, say, 80 or 100 years are much wider than the consensus among scientists suggests. Um, you know, so here's the deal. Just to give you my premises as I go about answering this, if you look at the amount of damage from climate-related events relative to GDP, relative to national wealth, they've gotten smaller, not larger, decade by decade by decade. If you look at just the nominal amounts, the amount of buildings that get flooded, structures that are hit, homes that are destroyed, just the nominal amount, that's going up. But you shouldn't just look at that dollar amount in a vacuum. You have to look at it relative to total GDP, or even more specifically, relative to total assets owned by Americans, or even over the course, even worldwide. And if you look at it just within the confines of the US, the amount of climate-related damage relative to total wealth has been declining over the past 100 years, not increasing. And to the extent in certain areas it has increased, not the whole country, but in certain areas, it's because we're building next to the seashore. So if you have more assets right on the coast, homes, apartment buildings, all that thing, well then yeah, when there's a storm, more damage is going to occur. Absolutely. So I think that climate change is a long-term issue that we have to focus on preparing for better, for flooding and things like that, and take measures to reduce the cost of climate change over time. But that doesn't affect economic growth over the next 2 years. I'm not like, and if you look at the total cost of climate change, if we stay on at least for the United States, if we stay on the trajectory of fossil fuels that's largely anticipated over the next 75 to 100 years, it costs us, okay, but it's only a tiny fraction of GDP. What they say is, oh, it's going to cost 10% of GDP 80 years from now, by the year 2100. Okay, but that's 1 year of GDP. You're doing the total cost of remediating climate change over the next 80 years relative to 1 year of GDP. Okay, this is just blatant lying with statistics. If you're going to do the total cost over 80 years, you have to look at total GDP over 80 years. And if you do it that way, it's a fraction of 1%. And the cost of remediating and preparing for climate change over that time, it's basically less than 0.1% of economic growth per year. So is it a cost? Absolutely. Is it the night and day Armageddon apocalyptic scenarios that are drawn by these academic scientists who just like want to get jobs with each other and want to get grants from the federal government? No, it's not quite as bad as that either. It is real, but not quite as bad. If anybody is really interested in this topic, I'm going to recommend reading a book by Stephen Koonin. Stephen Koonin, okay, he's one of the youngest professors ever at Caltech. Back in the day, he was never associated with a Republican administration. He was, in fact, the top climate advisor at the Energy Department under President Obama. Okay, and he wrote a book about climate change, and he takes a very moderate view. He shows you where it's real, and he shows you where people exaggerate as well. So if you're really interested in kind of a view, a scientific view by one of the top physicists this nation has ever had, who knows that issue thoroughly, Steve Koonin, Koonin. Please read it.
Thank you. I was going to add something too to that question, is that like the cost of insurance is a really big, and especially for people, say in California or in other states where there's been a lot of impacts with, say, fires and whatnot. the cost of insurance is not directly related to the increase in fires. It's also contributed, or a big part of it is the cost of rebuilding. If anyone who's done any construction or remodeling in the last couple of years can attest to, the costs have skyrocketed. The cost of regulations, the cost of labor, the cost of materials, all of these things have skyrocketed. So to rebuild a structure is much more than what the cost of much more than the insurance, cost is predicting. And that's what's happening. And in the state of California, a great challenge is that the insurance regulators capped the amount the insurance companies could charge for premiums. So then you became this imbalance of, we can't collect enough to meet our obligations as an insurer, that we have to be able to meet all of our obligations as an insurer. So we need to either raise rates, which we can't do because we're capped, or we need to pull out or reduce the number of policies that we manage or issue. So a lot of these costs have, just let's say, are more multifaceted than just what the effects of a changing climate is. It's also the cost of doing things. As our population grows, as our population, as you said, builds close to the coast or spreads out into the wildlands.
Yeah,
Multifaceted issue. It's not as simple as we'd like, maybe.
Yeah, the other issue with California has the most absurd land use policy structure of any state in the union. And here's why. You have these cities like San Francisco, extraordinarily, or at least pre-COVID, extraordinarily desirable place to live, that had a grand total net housing unit of increase in availability over the previous 40 years leading up to COVID of nearly zero. This is an extraordinarily desirable place to live, but the powers that be, the wealthiest people in San Francisco, had contrived these historical landmarks and all these other rules in terms of construction to make it so cost prohibitive that other people couldn't live there. Okay. And they're totally selfish about it. And yet the state will make up for it by allowing for construction in remote areas in the state where the power companies then have to build lines and electrical lines in places that are extraordinarily dangerous to build electrical lines. So they're building in all the wrong places in California and not building in the right places in California. And this upside down situation has led to some really perverse results politically. But again, the powers that be, especially in Northern California, do not want a higher population to share in the bounty and the beauty of Northern California. That's just the way it goes.
That may well change with new rules. Now Sacramento gets to determine local land building and land use. So that could well change over time.
Yes.
But thank you for that. Okay, a couple more questions here. Will there be any warning about Social Security being chopped? My fears is that if I wait until I turn 67 to sign up and get full benefit, the Social Security will be gone or reduced, and that I should have signed up at 62, for example, at least get a partial pay. Depends on when you were born, but you get the idea.
Well, first of all, I have to say that one of the most complicated decisions anybody ever makes, is when they should take Social Security, and if they have a spouse relative to the spousal, what the age gap is between the spouse's family situation, working, non-working spouse, all that stuff. So do not make that decision unless you talk to a financial advisor or get some really detailed information elsewhere. But I would highly recommend talking to a financial advisor. This is not a decision to make on your own. Second, when Social Security is about to run out of money, the Democrats are going to win. There's going to be a general revenue transfer from the Treasury Department into that Social Security trust fund, because not even the most hard rock Republicans are going to want to have their Social Security recipients in their states and in their districts suffer a 25% haircut all at once and permanently. So whether you like it or not, the Democrats are going to win on Social Security. There's going to be a general revenue transfer, and then eventually they'll get around to raising the payroll tax on future workers. And that's all there is to it. Okay. Everybody's going to get their promised Social Security benefits, and maybe some upper income beneficiaries might see a haircut, future upper income beneficiaries. If you're already 60 or above, don't worry about it. Okay, I'm 59. I don't have to worry. If they trim anybody, it's going to be the people who are today 50 and below. That's it, at most. So you'll get your benefits that are promised even if you're at the top. There'll be a general revenue transfer into that trust fund.
Okay, thank you. On a question here, not sure exactly what this means. So, the person who wrote this, if you want to add anything else really quickly before Bob finishes up, it says, what will it take economically to cut entitlements? So I'm going to translate this way I think it might be. And please, who wrote this, correct me if I'm wrong. What will it take? What will the economic pressures on our systems be that will force the government to make changes to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? What will be
It's when the interest burden goes very high relative to GDP. When it goes back to 3%, after a few years, the bond market vigilantes will force the politicians to act. And that's why eventually I think they bring the actuarial imbalance in Social Security and then Medicare back into line. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take going back to the politics of limits, because the interest burden is so high that politicians get worried about some sort of sudden and sharp increase in interest rates that renders people unable to borrow money to buy cars and buy homes. That's what it's going to take.
You and I know what bond vigilantes means. Just do a 3-sentence description of what.
Yeah, the term bond market vigilantes dates back to the 1980s and 1990s, when bond traders, Wall Street bond traders, would legitimately scare politicians into measures to reduce the deficit, because otherwise they were not going to buy all the new debt rolled over or issued by the Treasury Department.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation.
Sure.
So I think we've gotten all the big questions answered in relation to your presentation. And actually, I don't know if you want to stay on for the last 10 minutes, or if you have more to close out with, or anything.
One more question would be great.
One more?
One more would be terrific.
Okay. You know what? I will throw another question, because you did touch upon this. So I feel like this is as much you as me. So we'll both answer this one. What is fueling the stock market rally rebound? The different words were used, but what's fueling this? And I was going to answer, but I'm going to let you answer, because I get to talk every month and you're a special treat.
Okay. So here's the deal. I think stocks are about 10% or so overvalued. Does not mean run for the hills. Okay. Maybe be a little shyer, as I mentioned at the beginning, of what you would normally hold at this point in your age or risk profile financial goals. Okay. You will watch CNBC and Bloomberg and Fox Business, and you'll see people come on the TV and they will explain exactly what just happened. They're all full of it. Okay. And I'm not going to engage in that post hoc analysis where after the fact, I come in and tell you why it happened. You should only listen to people who on a consistent basis tell you what's going to happen in the future and get it right. Those are the people. People who come on TV and say, oh, this is why it happened. Well, where were you a month ago telling me it was going to happen if this is so logical? Okay. So I'm not like, it's like, listening to a football commentator after the Chiefs could do a come from behind victory against San Francisco in the Super Bowl, telling you why it happened. Well, where was this commentator 5 minutes before it happened telling you why it was going to happen? They were nowhere, because they had no idea that it was going to happen for that reason, in which case they shouldn't be commenting after the fact. Well, it could, because we're only dealing today with the reality of what we've seen over the past year. Okay. But there were like 50 different possible outcomes for the year ahead a year ago. Okay. And we're just dealing with one. So I'm not going to pawn myself off as some sort of oracle, like you'll see on these network TVs, of explaining things after the fact as if I'm so smart and we all should have known that this was going to happen. Baloney. Anytime you see somebody peddling it, put it on mute and go back to a game or something like that where you could actually find it interesting, because they're just people selling baloney.
Okay, I think we got most of it. I will close out with a couple of things. We have about 10 minutes left. And Bob, if you want to hang out, you can, because maybe you'll pop up with some, again, thoughts and ideas. One is I've been getting a lot of questions about the economic policy of both the Harris administration as well as the Trump administrations and what the proposals are. And I'm going to do a webinar on that. Maybe it will be not until October, because as of now, I checked this morning. We do not have anything on the Harris campaign. They have not yet put a platform up, economic or otherwise. There are some talking points that she released last week, and I will go into those. Again, I'm going to give her administration a little bit of time to see if they can post things, because right now, I said I don't have enough information, but I'll be able to do a little bit of a compare and contrast against the Trump's platform policies economically, and Harris's as well. As you all know, it's not an accident I'm wearing purple today. I don't take sides, just give you the information, kind of the facts on the ground and different ways to see it and consider it as part of our diligence and being informed voters. Also, for the purpose of this, I get the information directly from the candidate's website. That's why I'm holding off for the Harris Wallace administration to actually post their stuff, because the news media is very nonsensical, cherry picks information, it's twisted and kind of warped. In many ways, it's just not very accurate. So I just want to hear it from the horse's mouths. And so if you voters would like to do this as well, you can go directly to their websites. KamalaHarris.com is one, DonaldJTrump.com is number two. So pretty easy to remember. It's their names.com. You could go yourselves and look at this. So again, I'll talk on the economics. I'm going to stay out of a lot of the social and things like that, because that's not why you came to hear me anyhow. But just a little bit of compare and contrast, just considerations. But with a giant caveat that the makeup of Congress will affect what each candidate is able to do if they're elected. So just be patient, please. But again, I'm waiting for the Harris administration. Hopefully they'll post everything so I can get that done, but it may not be till the September. But I'll certainly do my very best in October, I assure you that. And talking a little bit about at least what Kamala has said to date on her policies. Trump's are already up and listed. And we're also where they're similar. There are some areas that they both are in agreement on, actually, and so will probably happen regardless of the elections. Let's see, we'll talk a little bit more, but I did want to a little bit tie into the last few minutes I have left, was a bit to tie into what really matters. So you got the economics, you got the analysis, you kind of got just the kind of hard facts on the ground. Obviously, in an election, it's a lot more than just the economic policies of each candidate. Bob mentioned this as well. There's a lot of reasons people vote, a lot of issues that are important to people. Different issues are important to different people for different reasons. So just a little bit of a caveat, none of this in any way should be construed as trying to impact or coerce people to vote one direction or the other. It's really just the intention is to be a source of information that's non-biased. The only thing that really matters, and these are the topics I want to bring up really quickly here, is the markets are used to change. Every election has change. Every election has some form of adjustment. Even if the president is reelected, you still have changes within Congress, and society changes. Society as a whole sometimes shifts more leftward or more rightward. Sometimes there's a response to one direction and it pulls back the other direction. So there's constant change. The companies whose earnings affect the markets, the underlying economic conditions will adapt to any election changes that happen. So don't fear the one wrong person gets in office and the world will end. From an economic perspective, this is normal, and this is going to happen multiple times during most of your lifetimes. So just don't, again, they're adaptable. They're adaptable to higher tax rates, as our individuals. Use good quality planners like Sequoia. Get a little plug for us here. We know how to navigate this space, and we'll adjust the plans according to any new policy that comes out, tax, economic, or otherwise. So keep that flexibility in your planning. It would be ideal, though, going forward, that we just do have any new ideas that administration has go through Congress. Less executive orders, less of this, which we've had this recent administration ruling by decree. In other words, the FTC sets the new laws. Departments have their own laws and they haven't gone through Congress. Things going through Congress is really optimal, regardless of who it is and what side of the aisle you're on. From the standpoint is it's time for the negotiations. Things tend to be more easily absorbable, and also there's time to plan for them. And then again, these in the markets, in the economy, in companies, in individual planning, there's time as things go through Congress and are being negotiated rather than this is the law type of policy. What Bob mentioned is probably one of the biggest issues facing us. It's not today's, but it is coming up pretty quickly, and that's government spending. I've talked about that before. A lot of people know it's a big deal. However, they don't want their favorite programs disturbed in any way. There are many solutions to it. You cannot raise taxes enough to solve for it. There's simply not enough money. It's a political talking point. You also can't cut everything either because we need certain things for our society to function. The negotiation and the moderate finding of the solutions is, again, why we hope to elect good political leaders, both in Washington and in Congress and the presidency. As I mentioned before, if you really want to be or consider being an informed voter, do go to the candidates' websites rather than news media, social media, friends and family's ideas. Even if you're very partisan, if you're very aligned to one party or the other, it's really worthwhile to just see what the other candidates, and this is not just the presidency, down ticket as well, to see what their proposals really are. I continuously have people bring up to me that they think so-and-so is going to do this and such, and that's actually not true. And you can see it directly on their website. So take the time to look at both candidates or all the candidates you're considering websites. Even if you're not going to vote for them, it's really, I think, important to be an informed voter to actually know the truth of what the other person's saying, not what you see on the media, because that's really tough. Let's see, the last one on there is geopolitical risks. We do have a situation right now. We just have a lot going on in the world. There are some significant geopolitical risks. And one thing that would be really important and to have less involvement both financially and militarily to help maybe cool the temperature in some of these geopolitical hotspots. Number one, the less money we're spending on foreign wars, the more money we have to meet our country's needs. Number two, and these can blow up into be a much bigger situation. That doesn't say that we don't defend ourselves, doesn't say that we don't consider how to defend others, but deciding on how and where we're going to get involved in these types of conflicts and where we want to be is something. I know there's a lot of different viewpoints on this subject, but from a pure financial aspect, pure economic aspect, peace is better than war. And it would be really nice to see our future administration, whoever it may be, kind of focusing on some peaceful solutions to the geopolitical events in the world. And what really matters, remember, you have a vote, make your vote, turn off your TV, relax, enjoy your life, try not to get too focused in the news. Doesn't make most anyone happy to do so. And there's so much more important and beautiful things happening in the world, within our communities, within our lives, within nature, with our animals, whatever that may be. I said the news is not there to make us feel warm, fuzzy, and happy. Even if your preferred candidates win, it doesn't necessarily make any happier because there's always a fear of what the other side will do. It's hanging there. I've seen that time and time again when the election's gone the way that someone wants it to go, but there's still that fear of the other side. Vote, drop it, and enjoy your lives. Again, sort of went outside my lane there as an economist. My highest intention is everyone feels at peace, focuses on what's most valuable in life. The economic considerations with the markets and the economy fall to myself and our team at Sequoia. Anytime you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to talk to you individually. I'm happy to talk to friends or family that have concerns or questions. I love this, as you all know, happy to help and happy to talk to people, and it can be more customized to your specific questions and needs. The intention of this broad-based is really to get a lot of information to a lot of people. It does not replace individual communication. Everyone's life is different, everyone's needs are different, and everybody's areas of focus are different. So don't let this replace the customized advice. With that being said, I will leave everybody to enjoy the rest of their day or whatever time of day it is that you're watching the recording. Any questions or ideas of other subjects or topics that you'd like, other speakers or areas of expertise you like, let me know. We have access to a lot of good people. And with that being said, bye for now. See you next month.